Men in the city are becoming anti-democratic. The theme of the 2020s has been paradigm destruction. Central banks and the currencies they print are teetering. Decentralized global supply chains are breaking and reshoring. Once respected corporates like Boeing, Intel, and Disney are flailing. Cultural centers like Hollywood are damaged beyond repair, and even the nuclear family is disintegrating. However, it is the breakdown of democracy that is perhaps the most shocking paradigm to fall from grace. The total failure of democracy to represent the will of its citizens, to protect the nation from rising violence, migrant invasion, electoral chaos, and spiraling poverty means the search for a new, more stabilizing authority has begun. Authority in the Western world has all but collapsed. The once commanding authority of Ivy League schools, the Fourth Estate, and international institutions the world over is in sharp decline. Likewise, the authority of fathers as heads of household, the authority of Christianity, scientific authority, and even the authority of once cherished ideals like the American dream are fading fast. The allure of democracy might be the last peg standing, and it is beginning to wobble. The need for authority is as natural to human beings as the need for community, because without it, there is chaos. Without authority, society descends into a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, where all manner of perverse human behavior normalizes. Absent authority, there are no checks on street crime. White-collar corruption is incentivized, social standards collapse, and nihilism seeps into every institution, starting at lower levels before rising to the level of the state itself. The slide into anarchy may not be immediately perceptible, especially inside stable pockets that insulate the rich and powerful. Eventually, disorder spreads like a disease until society fashions an immunodefense, and a demand for restoration of authority springs forth, suddenly and without warning. Like a stock about to surge, longer at the base, the higher up in space, momentum is gathering for such a public outcry. Inside mainstream circles, criticism of democracy is tantamount to treason in Western Europe and North America. But Western civilization has a long history of suspicion, at times revulsion to democracy, even among its progenitors, the ancient Greeks. Aristotle, Plato, Thucydides, and countless others regarded democracy as fatally flawed for one reason or another. America's founding fathers were equally skeptical and deliberately constructed checks on democracy as a result. Unexpectedly, democracy has lost legitimate authority in Western countries because it threatens the majority. It threatens the citizenry. The demoralized state of Western peoples today affirms this illegitimacy. Average Americans, Australians, Canadians, Dutchmen, Frenchmen, Germans, Italians, Spaniards, Swedes, and others who live under democratic rule are increasingly angry, frustrated, and alienated from the governments who fail spectacularly to represent them and fail by design. Year after year, decade after decade, election after election, average citizens vote consistently against the policies imposed upon them to no avail. Elections do not have consequences, and the voting process, the principal instrument of representative democracy, has been utterly subverted by a tiny elite who champions the demographic, cultural, and economic demolition of the legacy societies they rule. Chief among the issues that highlight the danger of democracy is immigration. Mass immigration, open borders, and demographic change are incentivized by democracy. Democratic values overrule and even nullify sovereignty rooted in common racial, cultural, religious heritage. Those who oppose mass immigration, or immigration at all, based on national identity are regarded as anathema, as an existential threat to democracy for this reason. Under such a regime, citizenship, or the citizen himself, becomes a mere bureaucratic classification of no importance or value, and is morally, legally, and otherwise subordinated to universal human rights. Democracy in such a bastardized form threatens the nation and its citizenry. Agencies of state, including administrative bureaucracies, police, and military, even welfare programs, are repurposed to serve as not citizens but voters. In other words, anyone the state prioritizes: immigrants, refugees, special interests, or privileged minorities. Myths like "we are a nation of immigrants" replace factual national origin stories, and founders become amorphous people tied to no specific demographic, race, or culture. Further, as the state grows in power, it gradually assimilates society too. Corporate conglomerates, commercial banks, Fortune 500 companies, and virtually any form of law-abiding private enterprise is turned against the citizenry. Within 2 or 3 generations, the entire state apparatus and the society it governs are captured and weaponized against the citizenry. A pillar of the democratic ethos, espoused especially by those on the right like Jordan Peterson, is that identity politics is dangerous. Such a statement seems to rest on 2 pillars. First, the premise that a strong political identity supersedes all other identities in a democracy. And second, if point 1 is true, tribalizing along cultural, religious, or racial fault lines is self-defeating because it undermines the umbrella political identity. However, if the premise is false, and it is, that identity is top-down, political, rather than bottom-up, cultural, racial, religious, the conclusion is not only false, it is dangerous. You might call this unanchored democracy, or democracy that is decoupled and turned against national identity. Left unchecked by strong elites, WASPs in America, for example, and patriotic organizations, democracy spirals into disarray. The fact of the matter is that democracy, rather like communism, disregards the nation and treats everyone, citizens or foreigners alike, as amorphous voters. As such, it ultimately turns against the very human irrigating systems without which the seed of democracy could not germinate. Obviously, these irrigating systems sprang from the distinct demographics who gave unique cultural, economic, and political expression to the nation or civilization. Han Chinese in China, Aryans and Dravidians in India, Persians in Iran, Germanic tribes in Germania, Romanized Gauls in France, Anglos in America, etc. Democracies actively nurture anti-democratic constituents inside them, so long as they are classified as minorities, victims, or some other kind of status that confers special protections the majority citizenry cannot secure. This kind of political game rewards in-group preferences for minorities or special status groups and denies in-group preferences to the majority citizenry. Eventually, the tipping point comes when anti-democratic minorities become large enough to take power and the democratic chain breaks permanently. The result is observable across the West today, namely Balkanization. After decades of open borders, democracy is so racially factionalized it is little more than a capture the flag for fragmented minorities, while the denationalized majority slowly watches the nation become unrecognizable and at present overtly hostile to its identity and survival. Tensions build and build as the majority's numbers shrink, as its political power contracts, eroding slowly at first and then rapidly until the founding national identity itself becomes outlawed. This often happens when the plurality of foreign voting blocs sense, based on amassed numbers and influence, they are on the cusp of seizing power, of capturing the democratic flag. The dangerous threshold outlined above has been breached. The unfolding tragedy in Great Britain in recent months is but one of many explosions soon to detonate inside the walls of democracy. The larger issue, however, is that the wheels of democracy are falling off the track. Democracy has laid a social minefield that could blow up at any moment. Crackdown against the citizenry is draconian out of necessity. Censorship, aggressive punishment of the native-born citizenry, media spin, and sanctimonious condemnation of racism, bigotry, and hatred against victimized minorities. In the final and perhaps most perfidious step, democratic heads of state virtue signal to reaffirm the values of diversity, tolerance, multiculturalism, etc. Democratic values all. At this point, the majority body politic increasingly senses democracy is a threat to its survival. As a result, the citizenry no longer believes in elections. They vote less. They turn cynical and averse to the state, and a dark pessimism about the future pervades the public consciousness. The state's authority sinks, and ultimately the citizenry conclude that democracy is a lie, a rigged game slowly destroying them, and of course this perception is reality. Disillusionment with democracy forces the citizenry to re-nationalize, and the specter of nationalist movements materializes. Contrary to consensus, views largely born of unfounded democratic propaganda, when democracy falls, it will empower the citizenry and save the nation, not destroy it. Nationalism is the lifeblood of nations, a spiritually stirring and epigenetic force that transcends mechanical systems like democracy or communism. It erupts spontaneously, organically, and mysteriously, and usually accomplishes a nearly unquenchable thirst for new outlets, new leaders, new parties, indeed a deep-seated desire for a new centralizing authority to channel and harmonize its energy. What new authorities are emergent? Is a new restorative, remasculinized nationalist movement scalable? Can the damage wrought by unanchored democracy to citizenry and nation be reversed, or is it too late? What lurks behind the hills of the coming struggle for power?